I think people get tattooed because, you know, there's not a lot of real stuff left in the world. And it's all like a 24-hour news cycle. Nothing lasts. With tattooing, it's blood, it's pain, it's permanence. When you get that needle in your skin for the first time, you have to be there. You can't just call it in. You have to sit there and take the pain, and then sit there and heal it. And then you got to live with the consequences of your action. Hey guys, welcome to today's little video. I'm going to do a topic today that'll be interesting to both clients and tattooers alike, and anyone else who's a little bit interested in tattoos. And that topic is going to be about pigments. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ink, the pigments that are in the ink, what makes ink, all this talk about it being dangerous, because I did an ABC radio show the other day. One of the questions I was asked was, are the pigments used in my tattooing toxic for the body? And that seems to be a very popular misconception in tattooing. In the mainstream, it's always in the newspaper, on the TV, and the radio about how heavy metals in the inks make tattooing cancer-causing and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not a chemist, so I'm going to give you the information I have and the way I understand it. But I have done a lot of research on ink, and I've made my own ink for the last 15 years, right? So I make my own ink from pigments, from dry pigments, powdered pigments, mix them up myself. I've been using them, I've been seeing the results. I mean, I do bodysuits, so I'm watching people come back year after year, and I'm seeing how the ink sits in the skin, how it settles in, all that kind of stuff. So I think I have a pretty good handle on ink and how it reacts in the body. I'll talk a little bit about the different kinds of ink, right? So like I said, my podcast, my videos are not about giving away trade secrets or anything, but I'll give you the Cliff's Notes, right? So you've got basically two different kinds of inks that you get tattooed by. You've got inks made from powdered pigment, and you've got inks made from dispersions, right? So all tattoo pigment is a result of organic chemistry, right? So when you say organic chemistry, basically it's made from chemicals, right? So the powdered pigments come from a chemical factory, and you've got safe pigments and unsafe pigments, right? Ones that are generally used like in cosmetics and food products, kids' toys, stuff like this. These are the ones we would use for tattooing, right? So the difference between, like, say, house paint and tattoo pigment or tattoo ink could be the same pigment, the same powder core, but we're using a different medium to put it on the skin or put it on the house, right? So while you're painting a house, you might use acrylics and stuff like that to make it dry and become weatherproof, whereas with tattooing, you would use alcohol or water or a few other ingredients like that to make it soluble to go in the skin. So when you hear like, oh, tattoo inks are made from car paint, you know, it sounds sensationalistic, but at the end of the day, the core pigment itself could be the same, right? That's not a bad thing. It's the same pigment like when they color your M&Ms red, right? It could be the same ink I'm tattooing with, just put in a different medium, used for different purposes. So don't let that scare tactic stuff freak you out, right? A lot of pigments are super safe, right? No one's died from eating red M&Ms, and as far as I know, no one's died from being tattooed with red pigment. The other inks I was saying are dispersions. So whereas I will get my powdered pigments from the factory in bulk powder, and I'll mix them myself with various fluids. Some inks that tattoo companies use come pre-dispersed in a liquid from the factory. So they've already taken the powder and then they've mixed it with a liquid, very, very fine, very, very small particles. And it's a lot easier for those ink companies to mix it with their formula of choice, bottle it, and sell it. The upsides and downsides to all these things, so I'll get into that. Unscrupulous ink companies will use dispersions at a very low pigment load to make more money. So you will get like these, you know, cheaper pigment companies that will buy these colors, you know, they'll mix their own flavors, or they'll buy all the shades already mixed from the factory. They'll put a little bit in a bottle, put the rest in, say, water and a couple other ingredients, and that's what they'll sell as ink, right? And very, let's say, easy to tattoo with because there's not a lot of pigment load. So the needles are putting the ink in the skin real quick. The pigment particles, because they're pre-dispersed from the factory, are very, very small. You got to think of tattooing as what you're doing is you're putting basically colored sand under the skin, right? That's at the end of the day what tattooing is, right? So the smaller the particles of sand, and how everyone these days is using cartridges and using really fine needles. So the smaller the particle, the easier to get the ink in the skin. Smash it out, and especially when you're doing color realism and this style of tattooing, you are blending, 5, 6, 7 colors all in one place. And that's hard to do if you've got big particles, right? But if you've got very watered down ink with very fine particles, it's very easy to blend those colors and make these amazing painting looking tattoos. Right? They look great for the photo. They look great on the skin. There's no skin trauma because the needles are fine, the ink is fine. The downside to that is they don't last. Right? The mechanism by which the body tries to remove foreign objects is that it absorbs what's in the skin. So if the particles are very small, it's a lot easier for the body to absorb those little particles, put them through the lymph node system, and flush them out. Right? So I've seen tattoos from the 60s where guys were using powder pigments like I use, like greens and blues and stuff from the 60s. And it looks still today like it's painted on. Like there's so much pigment there because the particles are so big the body can't absorb them and flush them out. And so that's why I use powder pigments. I make all my stuff from powder, mix it up. And sometimes it's a bit hard to get in the skin. It's a bit slower to get in the skin. Because I use bigger needles, but I'm also using bigger particles, and you got to massage that ink into the skin. But once it's in there, it ain't going away, right? And that's the big difference. A lot of these younger tattooers that are doing everything for the gram, and I'm not shitting on anybody, I'm just telling you how it is, don't fully comprehend, I think, the big picture that tattoos are meant to be for life, right? When I tattoo a sleeve on somebody, I'm making him a tattoo for life. That's why I take my time and I try to make things good because I want to, I get guys that come back 10, 15 years later, I see and their tattoos still look fucking great. And that makes me happy. That's what I do, right? That brings me, satisfaction with my craft, right? And so it's important to me, like I talked about needles in my post the other day, my little Instagram post, pigment's the next thing. If your pigment's not right, doesn't matter how good of an artist you are, how good of a technician you are, how great your bedside manner is, right? If your ink is shit, your tattoos are not going to last, right? They're not going to last in the skin. They're just not going to hold up, right? You hear these sayings in tattooing like bold will hold and this kind of stuff, and that's true. You need to use proper, good pigment, right? And so that's why some of these styles that come into vogue and get real popular real quick and then just frickin' disappear. I'm looking at like watercolor tattooing. I'm looking at a few other styles like that. In this fine line phase that's going on now, super fine, little, I don't want to say scratchy, but little fine lines with little tiny needles and real fine ink barely going in. All those tattoos are going to disappear. They're all going to be gone in a couple years, right? And maybe that's the point, right? No one wants to commit to a proper tattoo, right? The young people. So back to pigment. So the dispersions can be good. If the dispersions are mixed at a high pigment load with a good pigment density, they're okay. The issue with them though is still they're a very fine pigment particle in the ink, and if there's not enough put in there, they can be absorbed and flushed out over time. So that's why I'm a big fan of the powdered pigments. Now, the big thing people talk about, is the heavy metals in the inks, right? So I've got a few notes here. I've done a bit of research this morning just to refreshing my memory on things. One of the big ones you hear about is nickel, right? Nickel. Now, the powers that be that are trying to regulate tattooing, they don't talk about the different kinds of nickel. They don't tell you that nickel's in a lot of things, right? So you've got the metal nickel, you've got soluble nickel, and you've got insoluble nickel. Now, no doubt, soluble nickel that's absorbed into the body is not good for you. It causes allergic reactions and can cause issues. Bare metal nickel wouldn't be used for tattooing at all. It just makes no sense, right? It's like aluminum foil kind of stuff. It's not going to be in tattooing.
Now, insoluble nickel is fine. Doesn't hurt you at all. Totally, totally fine, right? Things like chocolate and apples and lots of food products, coffee, have insoluble nickel in them. Totally, totally fine. There was a Danish scientist that was trying to prove that tattoo ink was not toxic and that the methods the government in Europe were using were incompatible with reality in terms of the way they were trying to measure the metals and inks. So he did an experiment. He got a tattooer to tattoo a pretty large tattoo, 35 centimeters by 28 centimeters on a piece of fake tattoo skin. All right? Big tattoo like that. And then they used spectrum analysis to find out, okay, so once the tattoo was done, how much actual pigment, once it's all been wiped off and cleaned, has stayed in the skin, right? And I would suggest that the tattoo skin, the fake skin, would hold even more pigment than a real person's skin, because as the tattoo heals, that part's going to flake off and you're just going to have that tiny little bit inside, right? So he found that in a giant tattoo like that, there was only 367 milligrams of total pigment, which is nothing, right? And then of all that, they were using a ink that they made themselves that had the legal limit of 60 milligrams per kilogram of nickel in it. So in that big tattoo, when all it was said and done, there was literally 0.02 of a milligram of nickel in that. And to give you an idea of how much nickel that is, a cup of coffee has 0.2 milligrams of nickel in it. A 20-gram piece of chocolate has 0.02 milligrams of nickel in it. And an apple has 0.02 milligrams of nickel in it. So these things are used to scare people about tattoos and heavy metals and stuff. They're not accurate, and they're not based in reality at all. So then ask the question, so why are they using these incorrect methods and these scare tactics? Probably because the powers that be hate tattooing, right? So we just need to chalk that up to that. The other thing they talk about is barium. Now, barium is the same as nickel, right? You've got the metal barium, which definitely would not be in any tattooing. You've got insoluble barium, and you've got soluble barium, right? So insoluble barium is used in cosmetics, it's used in medicine, it's used in all sorts of things. And there's trace amounts of it in tattoo ink, in certain tattoo inks. It's totally fine. It's nothing to worry about. Soluble barium is a problem, right? It's toxic, but it's not in tattoo ink. Nobody wants to tattoo their clients with toxic pigment. It's not going to happen. Obviously, don't buy your tattoo pigments from a Chinese company on eBay, right? Buy your tattoo ink from reputable people. There's lots of good ink companies out there. And then you don't have to worry about these things, right? It's silly. It's like you wouldn't, there's a lot of things you wouldn't buy from the cheapest, most shady distributor, right? And tattoo ink is no different, right? So as a client, if you go to a reputable tattooer, you've got nothing to worry about, right? They talk about how the black ink is carbon ink and all that. It's totally fine, right? So that's a little bit about tattoo pigments, the stigma and all that kind of stuff. With the powdered stuff that I use, I find I get like I said, it's a bit harder to put in, but once it's in there, it ain't going anywhere. It's rich, it's vibrant. No tattoo ink is UV light fast, right? So that's why when I say stay out of the sun when you get tattooed, stay out of the sun when you get tattooed forever, right? It's not just while it's healing. People seem to think that once it's healed, you're fine to go in the sun, and you're not. The UV rays from the sun will break down tattoo pigment the same as it'll break down, if you put a photo in the window or you leave your jacket in the car, right? And the sun will fade it, right? You can't make, what they do with some of these products meant for outdoors is they put a light fast coating on it or a light fast chemical in with the pigment that prevents the UV from breaking it down, right? The ultraviolet rays. You can't do that with tattooing, right? There is no way to make tattoos light fast, right? They will be broken down by the UV. So if you've got a nice bright colored tattoo, and you go into the sun, no matter how well it's done and what kind of ink it is, the sun is going to destroy that. It's going to change the chemical composition of the molecules in those colors and change the colors. I've seen beautiful bright pinks just turn like a dull browny pink. White will literally turn to brown, right? Yellows will just disappear completely, right? So these are things to keep in mind, right? Pigments are fragile once they're in the skin and exposed to the elements. So the things I recommend to protect your pigment is, if you're going surfing or you're going to go to the ocean for a while or you're hanging out at the pool all day, get a rash sheet. Just get a rash shirt. A UV 50 rash shirt, long sleeve if you've got sleeves. You don't need to worry about it. You can be out there most of the day, right? And you're fine. Sunblock, in my opinion, does very little. Just regular sunblock, even the 50 stuff, doesn't do much at all to protect your pigment. Protects your skin from burning through a chemical reaction, but it doesn't actually protect your pigment from being destroyed by the sun, right? Because to protect your pigment, you need to reflect or completely cover those UV rays. So white zinc, not the invisible white zinc, the white zinc, the paste you see people put on their noses, you can buy tubes of that or sticks of that, and you can put that on your tattoo, and that will help reflect the UV rays off your tattoo. So if you don't want to wear a rash shirt, you can put that white stuff on your skin, and that will protect your pigment, right? Otherwise, just stay out of the sun. I mean, I've got tattoos. I might go in the sun for a couple of minutes, and I go in the shade, right? You can't love the sun and be heavily tattooed and keep your tattoos good at the same time. Those two things are now mutually exclusive, right? If you want your tattoos to age well and look good forever, especially if you've got bright colors. If you've got black and gray shading and stuff like that, it will also eat your shading. Your shading will slowly start to disappear and fade away. So, things to take into consideration. What else? As far as pigment goes, I think that covers almost everything that I wanted to talk about. If you have any questions, comments, I'm open to discussion on this. Like I said, I'm not a chemist. I've just been tattooing for a long time, and I've been making my own ink for about 15, 20 years now. I use a few other brands as well that I've collected over the years of particular colors that I really like. But probably 90% of what I tattoo with is stuff that I've made myself over the years using my own formulas. My black ink, I use a Sumi stick, which is compressed soot from burning various kinds of tree matter, and it's held together with animal glue and camphor. That stuff is completely non-toxic. It's just carbon, right, which is fine in the skin. I've never heard of an issue with it. People talk about other inks and stuff, black inks having issues. Again, there's been so many people tattooed, right? Millions and millions and millions of people over the last 20 years, let's say, when tattooing got really big and really popular. So for 20 years, literal square miles of tattooing have been done globally with various pigments, various artists. And the only thing that I have seen repeatedly in any sort of measurable way is some people have a certain allergic reaction to some colors very occasionally. Now, this is granted that the tattoo is healed properly, that the needles are clean, that the preparatory cleaning is proper, that it's in a hygienic environment and done by a professional. You know, if you take the best ink and the best stuff in the world and some non-professional jabs it into the muscle matter because he goes so deep, yeah, you're going to have fucking problems, right? So that's not the ink's fault, right? You know what I mean? If a professional is doing, we're not going into the meat or the muscle or the bone or anything like that. You know, tattoo ink only goes a little bit into the skin, right? You know what I mean? And so if it's done properly with good ink, there is no detrimental effects to that, right? That I am aware of, you know, and I haven't heard of anyone dying or getting cancer or anything from being tattooed. Not that I've seen. And I mean, you would know about it. The way that they shit on tattoos in the media and the way that they go after us and demonize tattooing, if there was an actual problem, we would know about it because they would be shouting it from the rooftops, right? Europe recently has brought in all these new pigment laws banning a whole bunch of blues and a whole bunch of greens, based on the stuff I was telling you about the different metals. But again, they're not measuring the metals properly. They're not, the way that they measure the metals in the pigment cannot differentiate between soluble, insoluble, and the metal itself. So while they might be saying, oh, there's so much of this nickel in there that's super dangerous, it's just insoluble nickel, which is totally inert and fine. So keep that in mind. Like I said, if you have any questions, any comments, hit me up in the DMs, hit me up in the comments section, and happy to discuss it with you. All right, guys? Have a great day. See you later.